There is a name that most Americans have never heard, a name that was deliberately removed from the pages of history, not by accident, not by neglect, but by a decision made in offices and chambers where power decided what the country was allowed to remember. His name was Robert Smalls, and the story of how America erased him is more disturbing than anything he ever did on the water. Begin in the summer of 1862. Charleston, South Carolina. The city was one of the most heavily fortified Confederate ports on the entire Atlantic coast. The Union Navy had been maintaining a blockade of the harbor for months, and the Confederacy knew it. Every ship that moved through that water was watched, catalogued, tracked, and armed. The CSS Planter was one of the most important vessels in the Confederate fleet operating out of Charleston. It was an armed transport ship. It carried artillery, rifles, and ammunition. It was a vessel of consequence, used to move military supplies along the coast and to reinforce Confederate positions at critical points along the shoreline. And it was crewed, in large part, by enslaved men who loaded cargo, maintained the deck, coiled rope, and answered to a captain who regarded them as nothing more than labor breathing on his ship. One of those men was Robert Smalls. He was 23 years old. He had been enslaved his entire life. He could not read. He could not vote. He owned nothing that the law recognized as belonging to him. He had no legal standing, no recognized rights beyond what his enslaver chose to grant on any given day, and no claim to his own future. The system of slavery in the American South had been designed, refined, and reinforced over 200 years to ensure that men like him never mattered, never accumulated power, and never posed a threat to the order that depended on their silence. And for 23 years, that system had worked exactly as intended. But Robert Smalls had been watching, not casually, not out of idle curiosity or restless habit, or the kind of distracted attention that fills long hours of tedious work. He had been watching the way a man watches when his survival depends on understanding every single detail of the world that holds him captive. He watched where the Confederate forts were positioned along the harbor, how many guns each one carried, and what angles they covered. He watched the signal flags they used to communicate across the water at night, when visibility dropped, and the only language that moved between ships and shore was light and pattern. He watched the routes the vessels took, the times they departed, and the rhythms that repeated night after night with a regularity that most people never noticed, because they had no reason to pay attention to it. He memorized the captain's habits, the times he slept, the times he drank, and the hours when his attention wandered most. He memorized the signal codes that every ship was required to exchange at each Confederate checkpoint between Charleston and the open ocean. He memorized the names of the forts, the number of guards stationed at each one, and the typical response times when a signal was sent. He memorized all of it, over months, quietly, without drawing attention, without anyone on that ship suspecting that the enslaved man coiling rope on the deck was constructing, piece by piece, a complete map of every vulnerability in the Confederate harbor's defense. And no one noticed. That was not a coincidence. That was the architecture of the system itself. The Confederate officers on the CSS Planter looked at Robert Smalls and saw exactly what they had been taught to see their entire lives. A piece of property, a body that performed tasks, a presence that required no vigilance, no suspicion, and no thought whatsoever. The system assumed, with absolute confidence built on generations of reinforced belief, that an enslaved man on a Confederate warship could not think with strategic precision, could not plan over months, and could not act with the kind of deliberate, calculated purpose that such a plan required. That assumption was not questioned by anyone aboard that ship. It did not need to be questioned. It had been reinforced for so long that questioning it would have felt absurd, like questioning whether the sun would rise. The certainty was complete, and that certainty was the crack through which everything that followed would eventually pass. On the night of May 12, 1862, the captain of the CSS Planter left the vessel to spend the night ashore with his wife. He took several of the senior white officers with him. What remained on the ship was a reduced crew, almost entirely composed of enslaved men. A vessel armed with Confederate weapons and loaded with Confederate ammunition, and a harbor full of forts that could reduce anything unauthorized to wreckage within minutes. Robert Smalls did not hesitate. He did not deliver a speech. He did not raise his voice or announce his intentions to anyone beyond the specific men who needed to know what was about to happen and why. He simply began to move. He gathered the enslaved crew members in the spaces below deck, where no one on shore could see them. Some of them understood immediately what was being planned. Others did not. Some were terrified. The terror was entirely reasonable. If this plan failed, if a single signal was wrong, if a single guard on a single fort decided to look more carefully than he normally did, every person on that ship would die. Robert Smalls told them what needed to happen. He told them the route. He told them the signals and the precise timing required at each point. He told them what each of them needed to do and when they needed to do it. And then he put on the captain's hat, walked up to the helm of the CSS Planter, and placed his hands on the wheel. He stood at the wheel of a Confederate warship in the dead of night, in a harbor surrounded by armed forts capable of destroying him at any moment, and he sailed. He approached the first Confederate checkpoint. He raised the signal flag, the correct pattern, the correct sequence. The fort responded with the expected acknowledgement. He passed through without incident. He approached the second checkpoint. He raised the signal again. Another acknowledgement, he passed, then the third. Each checkpoint was a single point where one mistake, one wrong movement, one fraction of a second of hesitation could have ended everything for everyone aboard. The forts were staffed, the guns were loaded. The night was clear enough that anyone paying close attention would have seen exactly what was happening on that ship. But no one was paying close attention, because no one had any reason to believe that the ship moving through the harbor at that hour was anything other than what it appeared to be. The system's certainty about who Robert Smalls was had made him, in the eyes of every person watching that harbor, completely invisible. Robert Smalls did not hesitate at any of the checkpoints. The CSS Planter cleared the last Confederate fort and moved into open water, beyond the range of Charleston's harbor defenses. And then Robert Smalls turned the wheel and pointed the stolen Confederate warship toward the Union Navy blockade line. He sailed directly toward it. He delivered a Confederate vessel carrying Confederate weapons, Confederate ammunition, and Confederate military intelligence into the hands of the Union Navy. He handed over a ship that the Confederacy had invested in, armed, crewed, and relied upon. He handed it over as an act of defiance so precise, so calculated, and so devastating to Confederate prestige and military capability that it could not be dismissed, could not be minimized, and could not be explained away by anyone who understood what had actually taken place that night. The Union Navy accepted the CSS Planter. The weapons were seized and inventoried. The ammunition was secured. The intelligence aboard, including information about Confederate positions, troop movements, and defensive plans along the entire coast, was cataloged and sent immediately to Washington. The men who had sailed the ship were received. They were free. The word itself carried a weight that no single moment could contain. Freedom, for men who had known nothing else but the opposite of it their entire lives, was not a feeling. It was a fact, a legal fact, an irrevocable fact. And Robert Smalls, a man who had been legally classified as property less than 12 hours before sunrise, became, in the space of a single night, one of the most consequential figures in the American Civil War. The newspapers carried the story across the North. Politicians in Washington praised it publicly. The Union Navy officially recognized the contributions of Smalls and the other men who had participated in the operation. Members of Congress were informed of what had happened and what it meant for the war effort. And for a brief, extraordinary window of time, the country knew the name Robert Smalls. The country understood, even if it did not fully reckon with the implications what that name represented, and what it proved about the assumptions the Confederacy had built its entire war effort upon. What came next took longer to unfold. It was quieter, and in the end it was far more damaging than anything that had happened in Charleston Harbor. Robert Smalls did not disappear after the night he took the Planter. He continued to serve the Union Navy for the remainder of the Civil War. He piloted vessels along the coast. He guided troop movements. He provided intelligence that proved useful in multiple operations. He was wounded in combat during an engagement at Bull's Bay, when he attempted to surrender his vessel to avoid the destruction of the men under his command. He earned the genuine respect of Union officers who had, initially, looked at him and seen nothing of consequence. The war demanded that the system revise its assumptions about what enslaved men were capable of, and Robert Smalls forced that revision not through argument, not through petition, but through action that left no room for reinterpretation. When the war ended in 1865, the country entered the period that history would later call Reconstruction. The enslaved people were legally free. The 13th Amendment abolished the institution of slavery across the nation. The 14th Amendment extended citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. And for a window of years that felt, to the people living through it, like the first real breath the nation had ever taken, black men began to hold political office, to participate in governance, and to engage in the civic life that had been denied to them since the very founding of the Republic. Robert Smalls was elected to the United States Congress. He represented the state of South Carolina, the same state where he had been enslaved. He served multiple terms. He advocated on the floor of Congress for the rights and protections of freed people. He spoke publicly about the conditions that continued to threaten black communities in the South, about the violence that went unpunished, about the contracts that exploited the labor of freed people who had no other option, about the gap between what the Constitution now promised and what the country actually delivered. He legislated. He held office. He participated in the machinery of American government as a full and recognized member. The man who had been legally classified as human property less than a single decade earlier was now one of the elected lawmakers of the United States of America. And the country should have remembered him for the rest of its existence. It did not. The reason it did not is not complicated. It is uncomfortable. The end of Reconstruction was not a natural conclusion to a political process that had simply run its course. It was a negotiation. It was a deal struck between Northern and Southern political interests who decided, collectively and deliberately, that the experiment of black political participation had continued long enough. The compromise that resolved the disputed presidential election of 1876 effectively ended federal enforcement of Reconstruction across the South. Federal troops, which had been the only reliable force protecting black voters and black office holders from organized violence, were withdrawn. The legal protections that had made it possible for men like Robert Smalls to hold office and for black communities to exercise real political power were not repealed in a single dramatic act. They were simply left without enforcement. And a law without enforcement is not a law at all. What followed in South Carolina was not subtle. White supremacist organizations moved through the state with systematic purpose. Voter intimidation campaigns were organized with the kind of precision that required planning, coordination, and institutional support. Elections were manipulated openly, and the federal government, now controlled by men who had agreed to look the other way, did not intervene. Violence was applied where other methods proved insufficient, and one by one, the black congressmen who had served during Reconstruction were removed from their positions in government, not through the democratic process that had placed them there, through the deliberate, organized destruction of every legal and political mechanism that had made their participation possible. Robert Smalls was among those removed. He was charged with embezzlement in connection with his time in office. The charges were widely understood at the time, including by observers who had no particular sympathy for his political positions, to be fabricated. They were a legal instrument designed to achieve a political result that the ballot box could no longer reliably produce. He was convicted in a trial that left little room for misunderstanding its purpose. He was sentenced to imprisonment, and while he remained confined, the state of South Carolina held a constitutional convention and passed a new state constitution that effectively ended black voting rights in the state entirely through a combination of literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses designed with surgical precision to exclude black citizens while preserving the voting rights of white ones. The system that had failed to stop Robert Smalls in Charleston Harbor found another way to stop him. This time it used the law itself as the instrument. But the deepest damage was not legal. The deepest damage was not political. The deepest damage was to memory itself. After Smalls was eventually released from prison, after the political landscape of the nation shifted permanently against the cause he had served, after Reconstruction was officially declared finished, and the country began writing the next chapter of its story, Robert Smalls was quietly, methodically, and thoroughly removed from the national narrative. Not in a single act of erasure, not through a formal decree or an executive order, or a public announcement that anyone could have pointed to and said, "This is the moment where it happened." Through the slow, accumulated weight of thousands of small decisions made by thousands of different people across decades, decisions about what was worth teaching in classrooms across the country, what was worth including in the history books that shaped how Americans understood their own past, what events deserved stone monuments in public squares, and which events were allowed to exist only in the silence between pages, what names were important enough to carry forward into the next generation, and which names were allowed to fade until they no longer existed in public memory at all. Textbooks did not include him. No monuments were erected in his honor. His name did not appear in the standard histories of the Civil War that were written and rewritten throughout the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. The story of the CSS Planter, when it was told at all, was told in ways that minimized what had actually happened. It was attributed to opportunity rather than to intelligence. It was framed as an escape rather than as a calculated military operation executed with precision. The man at the center of it, the man who had spent months memorizing signal codes and navigation routes and the behavioral patterns of Confederate officers, was written out of his own story, or reduced to a passing reference, or left out entirely, as though the night had simply unfolded on its own without a single mind behind it, as though no one had planned it, as though no one had risked everything for it, as though the ship had sailed itself. For close to 100 years, Robert Smalls existed in American history the way certain rivers exist underground, present, moving, sustaining life in ways that were never visible to anyone standing on the surface above. His descendants knew. The communities he had been part of carried fragments of his story through oral tradition, through family memory, through the kind of knowledge that passes from one generation to the next, not through books, but through voices in rooms where no one outside the family would ever hear them. But the official record, the public memory, the version of American history that was taught and displayed and referenced in public life, did not carry his name. Not in any way that reached the majority of the people who called themselves Americans. The question that this story eventually forces you to sit with is not whether Robert Smalls was brave. Bravery is not quite the word that fits what he demonstrated. What he demonstrated was something closer to precision, something closer to cold, systematic calculation applied under conditions where a single error meant death for everyone he was responsible for. He did not act out of impulse. He did not act out of desperation. He acted because he had spent a long time learning a system that was designed to render him invisible, and he used that system's own certainty about what he was against it in a way that the system was structurally, fundamentally incapable of anticipating or preventing. The question is not whether America deliberately erased his story. The pattern is too consistent, too sustained across too many decades to be explained by carelessness or oversight. The question is what that erasure reveals about the nature of the country that carried it out. A nation that can produce a Robert Smalls, that can benefit directly from his intelligence and his sacrifice, that can briefly honor him, and then spend the better part of a century methodically removing him from its own official record, is a nation that has made a choice. Not once, not in a single moment of failure or forgetfulness, but repeatedly, across generations, about whose contributions are allowed to be remembered and whose are permitted to disappear. That choice shaped what this country taught its children for generations. It shaped which monuments stood in public squares and which did not. It shaped which names became part of the national story and which names were left in the spaces no one was taught to look. And the fact that Robert Smalls was forgotten for so long does not mean the forgetting was passive or accidental. It means the forgetting was a decision. And decisions, even ones made across 100 years by 1,000 different hands, can eventually be traced back to the moment someone first chose to look away. There is a moment in the life of Robert Smalls that almost no one knows about. It happened 5 years after the night he sailed the CSS Planter out of Charleston Harbor. 5 years after he had already proven, in the most direct way possible, what he was capable of doing under pressure. And in that moment, the United States Navy court-martialed him. Not for a failure of courage, not for an act of cowardice or betrayal. The Navy court-martialed Robert Smalls for choosing to save the lives of the men under his command. The date was May of 1867. The war had ended 2 years before. Robert Smalls was now serving as a commissioned officer in the Union Navy, commanding a vessel called the USS Planter, the same ship he had stolen from the Confederacy 5 years earlier. The Navy had kept the vessel in service and, in a detail that carried its own quiet weight, had placed Smalls himself at its helm. He was a captain now. He held rank. He wore a uniform. He stood on the bridge of a ship that had once belonged to the enemy, and he commanded it in the service of the country that had previously classified him as property. On a morning in May, the USS Planter came under fire from Confederate holdouts operating along the coast of South Carolina. The attack was sudden. The enemy positions were fortified. The Planter was outgunned. Robert Smalls assessed the situation in the way he had always assessed situations, with precision and without sentiment. He looked at the men aboard his ship. He looked at the enemy fire. He looked at the odds. And he made a decision. He did not fight to the death. He did not scuttle the vessel. He surrendered the USS Planter to preserve the lives of his crew. The decision saved every man aboard from destruction. It was, by any military calculus that valued the preservation of human life over the preservation of a single vessel, the correct decision. It was the decision that a commander makes when the ship is less important than the people standing on it. It was the decision that Robert Smalls believed he was obligated to make, because the men on that ship had trusted him with their survival, and he had accepted that trust as something that could not be surrendered for the sake of a flag or a hull made of wood. The Navy disagreed. Robert Smalls was brought before a court-martial. The charge was surrendering a vessel of the United States Navy to the enemy. The argument made against him was not complicated. A Union officer was expected to fight. A Union officer was expected to risk his own life, and the lives of everyone under his command, before handing a ship to Confederate hands. The fact that Smalls had saved every man aboard was not irrelevant to the proceedings, but it was not the central point. The central point was that he had surrendered, and in the eyes of the Navy's institutional standards, surrender was surrender, regardless of the reasoning behind it. The court-martial proceeded. Officers who had never stood where Robert Smalls had stood, who had never looked at an enemy position and calculated the precise moment at which continued fighting becomes not bravery but waste, sat in judgment of his decision. They questioned his command. They questioned his courage. They questioned whether a man who had once been enslaved truly understood, in the way that the Navy required its officers to understand, what duty meant. The implication was clear even when it was not stated directly. The Navy had given Robert Smalls a ship. The Navy had given him rank and responsibility, and the Navy now needed to determine whether that trust had been misplaced. Robert Smalls was found guilty. He was suspended from his command. He was stripped of pay. The man who had handed the Union Navy a Confederate warship, complete with weapons and military intelligence, 5 years earlier was now being punished by that same Navy for choosing not to let the men under his command die in a fight he could not win. The case attracted attention. Several Union officers and politicians argued publicly that Smalls had made the only reasonable decision available to him under the circumstances. The Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, reviewed the case personally. Welles remitted Smalls's sentence. The punishment was lifted. But the court-martial had happened. The record existed. The Navy had looked at Robert Smalls, the man who had stolen a ship from the Confederacy, through months of silent planning and precise execution, and had told him, in effect, that his judgment in command was not to be trusted. That even after everything he had done, the institution still had doubts about what he was capable of being. The system had not learned. It had simply found a new way to express what it had always believed. This is what makes the story of Robert Smalls difficult to fit into the narratives that Americans are most comfortable with. He is not easy to place in a single category. He is not simply a war hero, because the war that made him a hero was also the war that produced the system that enslaved him. He is not simply a politician, because the politics that elevated him were the same politics that destroyed him when they were no longer convenient. He is not simply a symbol of resistance, because resistance implies a choice between two equally visible options, and Robert Smalls did not resist from a position of visibility. He resisted from a position that the system had spent generations ensuring would never be seen. What he did, consistently across every phase of his life, was force the system to see him, and every single time the system was forced to see him, it responded in one of two ways. It either used him when his usefulness was undeniable, or it moved to eliminate him when his usefulness had expired. The theft of the planter was useful. The intelligence was useful. The symbolic value of an enslaved man commanding a Union vessel was useful during the war. After the war, his usefulness became a threat. A man who had proven that the assumptions underlying white supremacy were structurally wrong was not an asset to a nation that was in the process of rebuilding its social order on the foundation of those very assumptions. So the system moved against him, not with cannons, not with the kind of violence that leaves marks visible to the eye, with courts, with charges, with the slow, quiet machinery of institutional authority applied to a single individual in a way that could be followed, observed, and eventually accepted as normal procedure. The embezzlement charge that led to his imprisonment was filed in 1877. The specifics of the accusation involved funds that had passed through his office during his time in Congress. The amount in question was not large. The documentation was murky, the kind of administrative complexity that surrounds any elected official who handles public funds over the course of a political career. The trial took place in South Carolina, in a courtroom in a state that had spent the previous decade systematically dismantling every legal structure that had allowed men like Smalls to participate in public life. The jury was white. The judge operated within a framework that had been recently reshaped by men who understood precisely what outcome the state required. The proceedings were conducted according to the forms of law. The forms were observed. The verdict was reached. Robert Smalls was convicted. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. The sentence was later reduced, and he was eventually pardoned by the governor, but only after the state constitution had been rewritten to ensure that no man like him would ever again hold the kind of office he had held. The pardon was not an act of justice. It was an act of administrative completion. The legal work had already been done. The political structure had already been dismantled. The voting rights had already been taken away. Smalls could be released now because there was nothing left for him to threaten. The system had already achieved what it needed to achieve. He was no longer dangerous, and so he no longer needed to be contained. He returned to Beaufort, South Carolina, where he had lived after the war. He lived there for the remainder of his life. He did not disappear entirely from public view. He continued to be involved in local affairs in small ways. He held a minor federal position for a time, a customs collector appointed by a Republican president, a role that ended cleanly and without incident when a Democratic president took office and removed him. He lived in the house where he had once been enslaved, having purchased it after the war from the family that had owned him. He lived in that house, in that town, in the same state where he had been held as property, surrounded by a community that had known him since before he was free, until he died in 1888. He was buried in Beaufort, the town he had helped to reshape, the town where he had exercised political power that the state would spend the next decade destroying, received him back into its ground without ceremony or fanfare. Just a man returning to the earth he had walked on his entire life. He died at the age of 49. The cause was illness. The newspapers in the North carried brief notices of his death. The newspapers in the South carried less, and within a few years of his passing, The mechanisms that might have carried his name forward into the next century were already failing. The men who had served alongside him on the planter, the men who had stood below deck in the dark and listened to his plan and decided to trust it, were aging and dying, carrying what they remembered with them into silence. The politicians who had known him were retiring or leaving public life. The war itself was being rewritten by hands that had no interest in preserving what Robert Smalls represented. This is where the erasure becomes most visible, because it did not happen in isolation. It happened alongside one of the most successful campaigns of narrative control in American history. In the decades following the Civil War, a movement emerged across the South, and eventually across much of the entire country, to rewrite the meaning of the war itself. This movement is sometimes referred to as the Lost Cause. It was not a single organization or a single manifesto. It was a sustained, coordinated, decades-long effort to reshape how Americans understood what had happened between 1861 and 1865. The Lost Cause narrative insisted that the Civil War had not been fought primarily over slavery. It had been fought, according to this version of events, over states' rights, over constitutional principles, over the dignity of a Southern way of life that had been disrupted by Northern aggression. The Confederacy, in this telling, had not been an army defending the institution of human bondage. It had been an army of honorable men defending their homes, their families, and their traditions against a federal government that had overstepped its authority. The enslaved people themselves were rewritten as well. They were not people who had been systematically brutalized, denied every human right, separated from their families, and held in bondage against their will for generations. They were, in many versions of this narrative, content, loyal, grateful for the civilization their enslavers had provided them. The war, in this telling, had not been about freeing them. It had been about something larger, something more noble, something that could be mourned without guilt. This narrative was not confined to fringe publications or the bitter writings of former Confederate officers, nursing old grievances in the privacy of their studies. It entered the mainstream of American culture. It was taught in schools across the South, and increasingly in schools across the North as well. It appeared in encyclopedias and reference works. It shaped the way Civil War monuments were built and how they were described on the plaques that bore their dedications. It influenced the films that Hollywood produced in the early 20th century, films that depicted the war and its aftermath in ways that reinforced the Lost Cause version of events. It shaped how historians framed their research and what questions they considered worth asking. It became, over the course of several decades, the dominant version of the Civil War that most Americans learned, not because it was accurate, but because it was the version that the institutions responsible for teaching history had decided to present. The speed with which this transformation occurred was remarkable. Within a single generation of the war ending, the narrative had already taken hold in enough classrooms and enough libraries to make the alternative version, the version in which the war was fought over the ownership of human beings, feel uncomfortable to discuss. And within this narrative, there was no room for Robert Smalls, a man who had stolen a Confederate warship, who had served the Union with distinction, who had been elected to the United States Congress, and who had been destroyed by the very state he had helped to preserve, could not exist within a story that insisted the war had been about something other than what it had actually been about. Robert Smalls was incompatible with the Lost Cause. So he was removed from it, not by a single editorial decision made in a single office on a single day, by the accumulated weight of thousands of decisions made by thousands of different writers, editors, educators, and historians who, whether consciously or not, were constructing a version of history that could not accommodate what he represented. The textbooks changed. The histories changed. The way the Civil War was discussed in classrooms across the country changed, and Robert Smalls, along with countless other figures whose stories contradicted the narrative that was being built, simply stopped appearing. He did not vanish dramatically. He faded, the way a color fades from a photograph left in sunlight over years, gradually, imperceptibly. until the image on the page is no longer recognizable as what it once was. For decades, the name Robert Smalls appeared in almost no standard reference work. The theft of the CSS Planter was mentioned, when it was mentioned at all, as a minor anecdote in the broader sweep of the war. An interesting story. A curiosity. The man behind it was not named, or was named only in passing, or was described in terms that reduced what he had done to something that did not require the reader to think carefully about what it meant. The intelligence he had delivered, the political career he had built, the way the system had responded to him at every stage of his life. None of it appeared. None of it was taught. None of it was preserved in the version of American history that was passed from one generation to the next. This is the nature of institutional forgetting. It does not require malice in every individual act that carries it forward. It requires only that enough people, in enough positions of influence, share a common understanding of what is worth preserving and what is not. And in the decades after Reconstruction ended, the common understanding among the people who controlled American institutions was clear. The war had been about principles, not people. The South had been honorable, not criminal. And the men who had fought against the Confederacy from within its own ranks, the men who had stolen its ships, challenged its officers, entered its political life, and demanded that the country fulfill the promises it had made. Those men were not part of the story that the nation wanted to tell its children about itself. Robert Smalls lived in Beaufort until he died. The house where he had spent his final years, the house he had purchased from the family that had enslaved him, still stands in that town today. For a long time after his death, it was simply a house. It changed hands. It was not marked with any plaque or sign. It was not recognized as significant by any historical organization or any branch of government. The man who had lived there was not commemorated in any way that a person walking past would have known about or had reason to investigate. The house was eventually recognized. His name was eventually restored, partially and unevenly, to the historical record. Scholars began to write about him again in the 20th century. Historians revisited the documents. The story of the CSS Planter was retold in ways that placed Smalls at the center of what had happened, rather than at its margin. Monuments were discussed. A marker was placed. His name appeared in some textbooks, in some states, in some editions, for some years. The restoration began. But the restoration was incomplete. And the incompleteness was itself instructive, because the question was never simply whether Robert Smalls deserved to be remembered. Of course he did. The question was what his erasure had accomplished while it lasted. What had 100 years of deliberate forgetting done to the way Americans understood their own country? What had been lost, not just about one man, but about the relationship between the nation and the people it had used and then discarded, during the decades when his name was kept out of the rooms where history was decided? The answer to that question is not comfortable. A country that can produce a man like Robert Smalls, and then spend a century working to ensure that he does not appear in the version of itself it presents to the next generation, has not simply made an error in its record-keeping. It has made a choice about what kind of country it is. It has decided that some stories are too inconvenient to preserve, that some truths are too destabilizing to teach, and that the image it holds of itself matters more than the reality that produced it. Robert Smalls did not get to choose how the country remembered him. He did not get to write his own history or defend his own legacy in the institutions where those decisions were made. He lived, and he acted, and he served, and he suffered, and he died in the house where he had once been held as another man's property. And then the country moved on. It moved on the way countries move on when the people they have used and discarded are no longer useful and no longer dangerous. It moved on by forgetting, by teaching a different version, by building monuments to the men who had fought to preserve the system that had enslaved him, while leaving no monuments to him at all. The ship he stole no longer exists. The CSS Planter was broken up after the war. Its wood was sold. Its iron was repurposed. There is nothing left of it to visit, no physical artifact to stand beside and contemplate in silence. There is only the record of what happened, and the long silence that followed it, and the question that silence leaves in the air for anyone willing to sit with it long enough to feel its full weight. What does a country owe to the people it used and then chose to forget? And what does it become when it decides that the answer to that question is nothing at all? Robert Smalls did not leave a comfortable answer to either of those questions. The system that erased him did not leave one either. What remains is simply the record itself. The facts of what happened, stripped of the narrative that was built around them to make them disappear, and left for anyone who encounters them to sit with quietly, without resolution, without comfort, and without the luxury of pretending the silence was accidental.